When I was growing up, my dad, who was somewhat of a philosopher, would often say things to me in famous quotes. A good example might be I would be coming in on a Saturday morning with a new 45 record of the Drifters singing something, and he would look above his paper and say, "A fool and his money are soon parted." I hate to point this out, but Leslie's starting to do that. And when she heard I was going to speak to the Challengers class, she said, "A little learning is a dangerous thing." So, forewarned. She may be right, by the way. On January the 30th, just a month ago, David gave a sermon about reading the Bible. It was entitled, "Open the Book." And the message was, we need to open the book. As Christians, we need to open it and read it. At the conclusion of the sermon, he pointed out 3 points about his method of reading the book. First, he said, don't worry about interpretation. As we read it, make your own interpretation. And his thinking there is that the interpretations of the Bible have been hundreds. I mean, we've got different languages, we've got different people, and oftentimes you'll read something and something new will come up to you. So he said, we, in our disciples group, believe in informed faith, not blind faith. So the idea is to open the book and look and read it that way. And one of the things he recommended was we get a study Bible. Well, I've got several study Bibles. I haven't opened many of them, but I have several. But the one that I enjoy the most is one called the People's New Testament Commentary.
Yes.
There you go. And it's a couple of guys who were very good ministers, very good theologians, and very good teachers.
Professors, yes.
Yes, and here's the scary part about that. Would you write a book and put your name on it if it was boring? This is this guy's name. Eugene Boring. She scared me to death. Okay, but his co-author was a fellow named Fred Craddock. And Fred was probably the most renowned minister in our group, forever, and was just a delightful guy. I just met him one time. He passed away in 2015. And it was at a thing out at Phillips, and you may have been there, Lynn, and I didn't realize it. Our minister is probably 6'5" and 160 pounds. Fred was 5'1" and 160 pounds. He was short. Fred was he visited and left and talked, got up to get behind the podium, and he carries a box around with him. And he whipped out this box and stuck it behind him, kind of crawled up on it so he could see everybody. And I still remember that being so cool, and the fact that once he started talking, nobody cared what size he was. He was tremendous. Okay, the second point David made was regarding evolution. He said understanding the Bible for him was very different at 55 than it was at 15 when he started. And the concept is as we grow older and know more and read more, things change, and so don't worry about it. It's worrisome and scary if you think exactly the same thing at our age as you thought when you were 18. So he said this evolution is okay, and in the Bible itself, there's a lot of evolution. We'll see that today when we talk about the Gospels. Jesus changes dramatically from Mark till we get to John. He was probably the same, but the view of him changed radically. Okay, and finally, David said, and this was good to me, that he does not interpret the Bible literally. He said, but he does take it very seriously. And I thought that was a really kind of cool thing to say because we're not fundamentalists in this church. We don't believe the Bible is the inerrant Word of God. We believe that it's been written by a lot of people who we don't know, many of them inspired, some of them not. So, it's good to be comfortable feeling that way and looking at it and saying, I don't understand this, and maybe nobody understands that. Okay. Today we're going to do a brief overview of the four Gospels. Hopefully we'll learn something that we didn't know, or with this group, something you've forgotten. I plan to spend about 10 minutes each on the synoptic Gospels. That means similar Gospels, and that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then the remaining time on John, which, as I said in The Wizard of Oz, is a horse of a different color. After each 10-minute period, we'll have a time for comments and questions, and if I don't know any answers, we'll just move along. Okay. In the minds of most Christian people around the world, the gospel tradition of the church has been blended. If the minister didn't say what passage he was reading from, you probably wouldn't know. And that's kind of a mistake, because each of the gospels are directed at different audiences and have a different point of view by the people that wrote them. That said, in all the gospels, the writer's main concern is faith in Jesus as the Christ and the Christian message. All right, let's go. We'll start with Mark, which, as you probably know, is the earliest and shortest gospel in the Bible. It was written to be read out loud at worship services of the early Christians. And as I understand what they would do, they didn't have any churches. You'd be in somebody's home, somebody would read it, and then you discuss it, argue, whatever. And reading it from the start to the finish takes about an hour and 20 minutes. And it's a very interesting read. I tried it, hour and 18 minutes for me. I'm competitive. But it takes about an hour and 20 minutes from the start to the finish. And I think if you're looking for a Lenten exercise that you could brag about and don't have much time, read Mark. It reminded me of my dad. When he got to be about my age, he announced that he was going to quit drinking martinis for 1 month every year. It was always February. Okay. If you want to read okay, here we go. Mark's gospel was written around the year 70, which was a tough time for the Jesus movement. And the main leaders, Paul, Peter, and James, had all died in the early 60s. And Paul's expectation of the return of Jesus in his lifetime had not occurred. In addition, in the year 66, towards the end of 66, Jewish zealots had revolted against the Roman Empire. Initially, they had some success, but then Rome reinforced their troops, and things changed dramatically. In the late 60s and early 70s, Rome brutally suppressed the rebellion in Judea, destroyed much of Jerusalem, and tore down the temple. Mark begins with John the Baptist coming out of the wilderness and baptizing Jesus in the River Jordan. After this occurs, the heavens split, and a voice comes and says to Jesus, "You are my son, the beloved. With you I'm well pleased." Note, God is speaking strictly to Jesus, no one else. Jesus immediately, and that word is used constantly, Paul, immediately. He goes here, and immediately did this, immediately did that. Jesus immediately begins preaching and performing miracles, but none of his followers recognize who he is, that he is the Messiah. This continues throughout the book, and this part of Mark is called by scholars the Messianic Secret. I think it's really only seen to that extent in Mark. God is working to hide Jesus' identity from his followers, and it doesn't become known until the cross and resurrection. Now, this is an interesting thing if you don't know that this is a purposeful deal, is the disciples, including Peter and James and other important figures, really appear quite obtuse. You keep thinking, what's wrong with these guys? How can they be so dumb? And of course, this continues throughout Mark. They repeatedly fail to see who Jesus really is. Even when he stops the storm and feeds the 5,000 and walks across the water. I just imagine these guys saying, "Hey, that's kind of cool." It's just not the reaction. When Jesus tells them he must suffer and die, they refuse to believe him. He tells them 3 times. Actually, this is the famous line, after complimenting Peter. In the next 2 paragraphs, Peter rebukes him for saying he's going to die. And this is when he says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." We say that a lot in my house. "Get thee behind me, Satan." Anyhow. So when Jesus is arrested, they all run away. And even the women who find the empty tomb with the stone rolled away failed to do what the young man in white there tells them to do, is go back and tell the others. They run off and do nothing. Mark's depiction of the original disciples was not flattering, but it served a profound theological message. He was writing in the midst of this devastating war, and the picture of Jesus' followers, as confused and uncertain, probably matched the same feelings of his readers. His audience knew that Peter, James, and the other apostles got their act together, started going out and preaching the message, and many of them suffered the ultimate price, death, for what they were saying and doing. So the message was that the original followers of Jesus had ultimately learned how to follow him truly in suffering and discipleship. So could the later Christians, the people that were the audience of Mark's book. About 2/3 of the way through the gospel, there's a dramatic change. First 2/3 of Mark, Jesus is performing miracle after miracle. Then on the way to Jerusalem for the passion part, all of a sudden he doesn't do any more miracles. He becomes very human. He becomes angry. He becomes scared. It's a different Jesus. It's a very human Jesus. This aspect of Jesus is called the suffering servant, the servant to mankind prepared to suffer on the cross. Think of the prayer in Gethsemane. Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. And later on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which, by the way, is from Psalm 22 and was very appropriate in the circumstances. He's on the cross. Anyhow, the Jesus in Mark is the most human of all the Jesuses, and my favorite portrayal of him. Okay, that's pretty much a quick overview. In a few words, our main takeaway from Mark would be earliest and shortest, the Messianic Secret, and suffering servant. Okay, does anybody have any comments or questions?
Want to talk about the extra endings?
Yeah, tell them about that. That's good. Well, there's 2 extra endings, right? Okay. The resurrection part is just, in fact, I didn't even mention this. One of the reasons it's so short is there's no birth narrative, and the resurrection is about a half a page, the part that Mark writes about that. And people got concerned, and probably maybe 100 years later, they said, this just ends, this is the wrong ending. We need to say Jesus reappearing and Jesus doing this and that. And so 2 additional endings were prepared and written. Neither one of them are very long, but they both have Jesus appearing to the disciples and so forth. The first one just had the woman running away, and that was the end of it. So that's kind of an interesting deal. But I think nearly everybody just says the first part's the actual writing of Mark. Okay, any other questions? Good question.
Was there any reason for the order Matthew was first and Mark?
That's coming up. Matthew, we'll talk about Mark. Good question, buddy.
Yeah.
We worked on this together. He's the prompter. Okay. Matthew was a favorite gospel of early Christianity, always appearing first in the list of the books put in the final Bible. It was also a favorite of Augustine, however you pronounce it, and he was, by far the prime theologian of that whole time frame. And it's really a beautiful book if you read it. Favorite passages from the Jesus story are still most likely to be remembered from this gospel. For example, the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, and the Lord's Prayer. The ones we do in church, that's the ones we generally use. One reason for the popularity of Matthew, which was probably written 20 years after Mark, around 90 or so, is that people originally believed that he was an eyewitness to all that, to everything that was going on. Well, obviously, if it was written 70 or 60 years after Jesus' death, he wasn't, but that was a reason for him. And the other two, Mark and Luke, never even claimed to be eyewitnesses. Mark is the major source of Matthew's narrative. He takes 90% of Mark, and it is in Matthew. Now, he made some interpretive modifications that, even a word or two could be significant, but in general, he uses almost all of Mark. For his teaching material, Matthew draws mainly on an early collection of Jesus' sayings called Q, which is also used by Luke. Q is the abbreviation for the German word Quell, which means source. This source is no longer in existence and had been in existence for, I guess, all of modern times. And why it was German, why we use these words, the first scholars to really look at the Bible from a historical perspective were Germans. And in fact, probably one of the most famous books written by Albert Schweitzer was, The Historical Jesus. This is like 1908 or something. Okay. In addition to these two major sources, Matthew also had a collection of materials that don't appear in any other gospel. And so what they've done is they've designated those materials as M. The materials, the teaching materials that are not included in Mark as Q, and then Mark. And so you can go through there and say, okay, this is M, this is, from where everything came from. Finally, to understand the Jesus story, Matthew is the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures. They play a major part, particularly early on in the gospel. As I mentioned earlier, Mark doesn't have a birth narrative, but both Matthew and Luke do. And it is interesting how different they are. In Matthew's story, there's no journey to Bethlehem. They live in Bethlehem and live in a house. The author assumes that, this gives him a little bit of a problem because Jesus is referred to as both a Galilean and one who came from Nazareth. Matthew has to develop a story that gets him around all those places. And so the story turns out to be the slaughter of the innocents. And this also does another point for him. You all remember the slaughter of the innocents? Okay, this is when Herod, after talking to the three kings, decides, I've got to get rid of this kid who's going to be the new king. Now, you've got to have a big imagination to have a 40-year-old man say this 2-week-old baby is going to cause me some problems. But this is Herod coming up with this. And so an angel comes and tells Joseph, you guys got to get out of here. Go to Egypt. And he goes to Egypt, where he stays until this Herod dies. This is confusing. I'm guessing there's several Herods in the Bible. And then the angel comes back and says, okay, you can come out now. And when he comes out, he goes to Bethlehem, then he goes to Galilee, then he ends up in Nazareth, so he's fulfilled everything that he's supposed to fulfill. And so it's kind of an interesting deal there, but think of the story about the slaughter of the innocents, and then think about Moses in Egypt when the Pharaoh decides to kill all the kids, the Hebrew kids under 2, because the population is growing so quickly. And Moses somehow escapes when his mom puts him in the basket and he's rescued by the Pharaoh's daughter. Talk about the irony. One of Matthew's big points is that Jesus is the new Moses. And so this is where he's, the new Moses. And because I guess in the Hebrew religion, Moses is up there with David and Abraham. 3 of them are probably the big 3. So I don't know if they'd be referred that way, but big 3. Okay. Okay. In contrast to Mark, Matthew shows the disciples recognition of Jesus' divine identity and a growing understanding of his teaching. I mentioned recently Mark's guys when he walked on water and fed the 5,000, they just would go, well, wow, But when the same thing happens in Matthew, they exclaim, truly, you are the Son of God. So early on recognition of who Jesus really is. Matthew has something else that's kind of interesting. In chapter 13, which is not found in any other Gospels, Jesus tells some parables. That one of them, the parable of the weed, that nobody really understands. And so the disciples who have been with him go to him and say, tell us what this means. And so he explains to them. He says, now do you understand? And they say, yeah, we understand. And then he tells them 3 more. And they understand those 3 too. Well, then Jesus announces, and I'm going to paraphrase this because he announces, okay, you're now ready. You've learned the scriptures. You've learned the correct interpretation of them. You are ready to go out and disciple to the world. And as you recall, the end of the gospel, Jesus sends his disciples into the world to make new disciples and teach them everything that Jesus has commanded. The disciples are educated, trustworthy links between Jesus and the later members of the church. Okay. And one of the kind of, I don't know what word to use, I'm just going to say puzzlements or paradoxes of the gospel is that Matthew takes real aim at trying to show that Jesus is the Messiah. Some of it just really stretches out and it's pretty weird, but he really makes this attempt. And he keeps talking about, and this was done to fulfill this in the Old Testament. And this was done to fulfill this. And despite that real effort, he was even madder at his fellow Jews than, Mark was. Mark wasn't Jewish, but Mark, talked about the Pharisees a little bit, but it got stronger, that anti-Jew thing got a lot stronger in Matthew than it was in Mark. My favorite passage, and it's also found only in Matthew, and I'm going to open the book. Is that good? Opening the book is something called the judgment of the Gentiles, and it was basically the kind of the next to last parable you made, or before the plot to kill Jesus began, and I think maybe 2 days before the Passover. Okay, here's what the judgment is. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations shall be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. You got to figure out what you'd rather be, as a sheep or a goat. And I'll tell you, sheep is the way to go. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, come, you that are blessed by the Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you in the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, what was that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you as a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we were sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer him, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of those who are members of my family, you did it to me. Then he will say to those on the left hand, you that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared by the devil and his angels. For I was thirsty, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick, and in prison, you did not visit me. Then they will also answer, Lord, when was it we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you? And then he will answer, truly I tell you, just as you did not do it for any of the least of these, you did not do it for me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteousness to eternal life. I have always liked that, and I've got to believe this passage does more to encourage charitable living than anything I've ever read. The whole concept of Jesus is in every person that you see. Okay. Our takeaway from Matthew. Jesus is the new Moses, the fulfillment of Jewish scriptures, the evolution of the disciples to prepare pupils of Jesus. Any questions or comments on Matthew? Thank heavens. Okay, if I'm doing well now we managed to kill enough time, so we're not bad. All right, good. Okay, on to Luke. Like Matthew, Luke uses Mark as a major source, although less than Matthew. He uses about 50% of Mark. He also uses Q, the same Q. In addition, Luke had various oral and perhaps written sources not documented anywhere. The material is designated L, so that's Luke's composition, and M for Mark and Q. And for the most part, Luke follows Mark closely. He doesn't make many changes. He does omit a whole big part in the middle, though. The Gospel of Luke is the first book in a 2-volume work that scholars call Luke Acts. Luke Acts tells a grand story, from the birth of John the Baptist and Jesus to the arrival in Rome of the Apostle Paul, a history of events that spans about 6 decades. Like Luke Acts presents not merely a gospel, an account of Jesus' memory and death, but also the first history of the Christian movement. It's probably the latest gospel, written sometime between the years 100 and 120, although John may be from the same time frame. In the opening sentence of the gospel, Luke acknowledges that he is not the first person to write about these things. Many, Luke says, have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us. Luke has used these previous writings and thoroughly invested everything in them himself to create the real account. He presents himself as a historian, someone who has sources and critical analysis and analyzes them. It is clear, however, that Luke is not concerned merely to write an accurate history. Perhaps what best describes his intent is theologically interpreted history, or the story of God's mighty acts in history. Luke has many themes. Here's some. Jesus is the defining center of history. God is the champion of the poor. Repentance. Now, repentance, he is really big on repenting, and uses that phrase 25 times, more than anybody else in the New Testament. And finally, the Holy Spirit at work. When things happen, it's because the Holy Spirit is making it happen. Okay, let's consider some parts of Luke that are significantly different than Matthew. Since Luke was written after Matthew and also used Q, some of the passages have come down totally different sources. We can start with the role of John the Baptist in the birth narrative. Luke divides history into 3 general time frames. The first being the time of the prophets, the second, basically the 1 year of Jesus' ministry, and the third, from that point forward, the time of the church. This is why scholars think that he put such an emphasis on John the Baptist and the birth narrative. I'm not going to go into it much, but it starts off with John's parents having him, Elizabeth, his mother, and it's the same story as Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah, I mean, the same deal. She's barren. They're old. They're not going to have any kids, and an angel comes and says, "Guess what's going to happen?" And, "Oh man, you got to be kidding!" So this is the story of John, and of course John, and all the pictures, as you say, where they're playing together. John, even at 2 years old, wore a wolf coat or something, and Jesus has a halo. So, you see those things? Okay. With this scheme in mind, it becomes clear why he devotes a lot of attention to him, because it's the transition from this old, big, long period to the new person, Jesus. This is the transition. In Luke's story, the angel visits Mary, not Joseph, and they live in Nazareth, not Bethlehem. If Joseph had to take a wife, who is described as great with child, to Bethlehem, it would require a 94-mile donkey ride. None of the details in Luke's story can pass the test of history, but that's not important. What's important is the message he was giving, and the message he was giving was that God loves the poor. They are his chosen ones. In Matthew, Jesus is visited by 3 kings who bring gifts. In Luke, it's the shepherds, the poorest of the poor. A second interesting comparison is the Beatitudes, Jesus' list of blessings. In Matthew, Jesus blesses the poor in spirit and those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. In Luke, however, Jesus just blesses the poor and just the hungry. Also, Luke has the woe, a set of woes for other people. The first of which, and it ought to scare some people in here, is woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. In other words, if you have a good life here, you're going to pay for it later. Okay, the story, and this comes several chapters after the Beatitudes in Luke, is the rich man and Lazarus. This is not the same Lazarus that's in John. Okay, I'll read a little bit of this. This is kind of always thought this was kind of a bit of a scary thing. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with that fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his wounds. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried in Hades, where he was being tormented. He looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus at his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to help dip a finger in some water and cool my tongue. I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your life you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he's been comforted here, and you are in agony." Okay. You know, the thing about that thing, if you think about it, is the rich man didn't actively do bad things. He mostly dresses up in purple and eats fancy meals like some of us do. But he failed to do what Jesus calls us to do, which is to share our blessings with those less fortunate. Remember, it is in Luke where Jesus says, "For whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required." Some of the best loved parables are also found only in Luke. For example, the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son. Finally, Luke's passion story contains many differences from Mark's gospel, which was his guide. By the time Luke was written, and this is how I was talking about evolution here, the idea of Jesus suffering a sense of separation from God, or even from him having felt forsaken by God, was more than the Christians of that time could bear. It was also too far human a cry for a Jesus that was becoming more and more divine. So the original saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" just disappears. He leaves it out. And this is where he comes in with three new sayings. First are the words of forgiveness to the soldiers. "Forgive them, Lord, Father, forgive them, for they not know what they do." Lest Luke has Jesus have a word of hope to one of the two thieves, a man Luke describes as having become repentant. "Today you will be with me in paradise." And finally, has Jesus speak a word of trust at the moment of his death. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Any questions about Luke? And Luke is the one that David is kind of chosen to do our whole Lenten service on. That's what we're supposed to read parts of. So you can get a head start if you want to. That doesn't start till next week. Okay. Yeah, I think in judging these things as far as writing ability, Mark is pretty primitive. Matthew is a step up, and then Luke, I think, is a further step up. So it's pretty interesting. Take away from Luke, mostly I would say his concern for the poor, and second, that Jesus came to seek out and save the lost. There's others, obviously. Questions or comments? Okay, Mike.
How has developing this study for us affected your perspective on the way you live your life? Particularly Luke.
With Luke? Oh, I think, as far as sharing and being good and being generous and doing all that aspect, or I think Luke is a lot tougher on that than maybe even the others. I mean, he's saying this is what you're here for, taking care of your brother and sister. So, we look at each other quite well. We got an opportunity today, the week of compassion. So if you haven't written a check, go home and get a checkbook. So, somewhat, I was lucky to grow up in a family that was pretty darn generous. Except the old man was pretty tightwad too. But as far as he always made a pledge at the church, and he always was, that type of thing. So I think it's how you're raised really kind of helps that as far as your position. But I tell you what, I really got into this. Leslie will tell you. I'm reading and writing and studying, and it was really kind of enjoyable because my brain is kind of dried up quite a bit. This is comeback trail, okay. Okay, earlier on, we discussed the Synoptic Gospels and why they present them different theologies and emphasize different themes. Most of them tell the same stories. And Jesus speaks in approximately the same way. The Gospel of John, however, things look very different. I'm going to just give you a quick reading of some of these differences, if I can find them. Well, I may or may not. Let me look here. Here we go. Okay, this is John. John, there's no account of a miraculous or virgin birth. It's not conceivable that the author of John would not have heard these stories, but he chose not to use them. In the fourth gospel, John the Baptist never baptizes Jesus. He bears witness to him, but he doesn't baptize him. No account of the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness or the transfiguration of Jesus when he spoke to Moses and Elijah. No description of the Last Supper. Nowhere in the gospel does Jesus share a Passover meal with his disciples in an upper room. In place of the Last Supper, gospel tells about the feet washing ceremony. In fourth gospel, the miracles are transformed into signs, which describes a dramatic truth that's happening in the human consciousness of Jesus. Host of memorable characters that don't appear anywhere else in the New Testament. Parade of characters begins in chapter 1 with a man named Nathanael and concludes with a character known as the beloved disciple, which is kind of the mystery disciple. I mean, different people think it's him or her, but it's kind of an interesting deal. You recall this last Sunday when Jesus had the woman who had committed adultery and did the thing about he who without sin can throw the first stone, and then kept writing on the ground. That was kind of a beloved, I mean, this is kind of, what did he write? What did he write? Nobody knows, you know. So I think that's enough of some of the different things. Two good examples of the differences between the Synoptic Gospels and John's are Jesus' violent acts in the temple and his feeding of the 5,000 people. In John chapter 2, Jesus makes a trip to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. He enters the temple and sees the people selling sacrificial animals and changing money, makes a whip, drives the animals out, and overturns the tables of the money changers. Okay, this incident is familiar with the Synoptic Gospels, but all of them place in this incident at the end of Jesus' life. In these Gospels, Jesus only takes one trip to Jerusalem. It's a fatal one in which he's arrested, put on trial, and executed. In John, however, Jesus makes multiple trips to Jerusalem, and this violent act occurs very early in his career. Both the Synoptic Gospels and John cite a Bible verse to understand what happened. You all remember the one, obviously, from the Synoptic, and this is, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all people." This is from Isaiah 56:7. In John is Psalm 69:9. "Zeal for your house will consume me." So it's a kind of an early hint about Jesus' terrible end and the fact that his death and resurrection are coming. So it has a higher spiritual meaning. In John, he feeds the 5,000 people, and then disciples get into the boat in Galilee and see Jesus walking on water. Mark 2 has this thing. But in John, the next morning shows up the same big crowd, and he gives a talk, a long dialogue. We talked earlier about the big difference in John is the long dialogues and not the short statements. Anyhow, a long dialogue, and this is one where he says, "I am the bread." He talked about we don't have bread. And bread of life that has come down from heaven. Okay. These two examples illustrate the distinctive nature of John's gospel, conflict between Jesus and persons called simply the Jews takes place from the start. Jesus talks in long speeches and dialogues rather than short parables and sound bites. Jesus' actions are signs, symbolic acts that point to themselves to a higher theological truth. John has sometimes been called the spiritual gospel because it takes greater interest in theological meanings and spiritual concepts than the others. A group of American biblical scholars called the Jesus Seminar, which was founded in 1985, asked the members to vote with colored beads on the sayings and doings of Jesus in the Bible. You know, a red bead would be, actually, he definitely did this. Pink would, he didn't do it, but he could have done it. It sounds like him. Then there's gray, which is, and then you go to black, which is just didn't happen. John's gospel is about 98% black. So, which is, like we talked, if you're not taking it literal, it's not a problem. None of this gospel passed the test. And the big thing that was particularly true of was all his I am, comments. And if you read the gospel, and I did more this last week than I have in years, he says this constantly. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, I am the bread of life, I am the good shepherd, on and on. And if you think of the meaning of I am, you go back to the Hebrew thing, I am is God, the great I am. And so he uses that in effect like he is God. Okay, let me move down here. Needless to say, this is kind of fun. When the Jesus Seminar began publishing their results, and the results were, what they did is they had, I think, 150 members of this thing. 50 of them were scholars. The other 100, I don't know where they came from. But they voted, and this was just a consensus. You may have had some of the scholars say, oh yeah, you did that, and the rest of the people vote not, and that's what was reported was the consensus of the group. So, but boy, I tell you what, there were a lot of people that didn't like this report. And I've got to read some of the comments, and it's amazing to me how good Christians can be so tacky to each other after reading this. So, okay. One of the members of the seminar was a fellow named Marcus Borg. And Marcus wrote 7 or 8 just marvelous books. Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, and just a good book. Anyhow, I attended a couple of things where he spoke. One of them at your old church at Trinity. They brought him in, and he had this very calm, voice you just like to listen to. And he made a point one time about the I am speeches of Jesus and John. He said Jesus didn't say them, but they were true. And he said he wished it had been written in the third person with someone saying, he is, he is, he is. When you got the I am, I always think of Muhammad Ali. I am the greatest, whatever. Okay. Fourth gospel has been traditionally read and understood by most people as a work of one person. That view is not shared by scholars. At least 3 different authors, and maybe 5. They see it as a book that went through a series of editorial changes by the different authors over a period of years until it reached the stage of development that we have today. Without question, John demonstrates the highest Christology of the Gospels. We've traveled a long way from the suffering servant of Mark to the countless times, John, where Jesus employs the divine I am. It is at the cross where this Christology is clearly shown. There's no prayer at Gethsemane, no despair on the cross. Jesus is in charge. And with his final climactic words, it is finished, the story is brought to a triumphal end. Look over here. That's enough of John, but not quite. Throughout the gospel, people of the author simply calls the Jews oppose Jesus every time. The gospel's anti-Jewish rhetoric has continued to a tragic history of anti-Semitism in the Christian tradition. While other gospels depict conflict between Jesus and certain people in the Jews, the Pharisees or chief priests and elders, John most often just uses the general term, the Jews. And in fact, there's one place in there, shortly after the feeding of the 5,000 where he's speaking to the Jews, and they have a big argument, and John hears Jesus saying, "You are the sons of the devil." You know, so I mean nobody believes that Jesus ever said that but some fellow Jews, but that's what John said. So the question comes up: why this anger? Why this? Well, more people have studied this, and they say, you know, at this time you had certain people who were Jewish Christians, and you know, stayed in the same place, and somewhere along the line there, the more fundamental or standard Jewish synagogue said, "Hey, if you believe this, you can't stay in the synagogue." So they expelled him. And a theory is that this had happened right this time when he's writing this, and so he puts this story of being expelled, the story of being treated poorly, and takes it back 80 years when Jesus was around. You know, there's no real history of this happening during Jesus' time with any, you know, strong feeling. In fact, this was kind of a more recent thing after the fall of Jerusalem and everything. But I think, in my mind, at least from reading this, is that why he just said the Jews rather than the Jewish leaders is his feelings were hurt that his friends stayed in the synagogue and didn't join him with this new movement. And so all of a sudden, it's the Jews. And, you know, it's probably of all the Gospels by far, this is the one that has caused, you know, the anti-Semitic acts and the justification for those acts and, you know, persecution and murder of millions of people. Okay, any questions about John or thoughts? We've got a good 1 minute to ask.
I think it's interesting that we've got 4 different views, and I think we're lucky since we know so little about Jesus between the time he was a child and the time he started his ministry, that we have at least that to work with.
You know, there were, and you probably are much more familiar with this than I am. I'd like to look into it a little bit more. Elaine Pagels, I think, is the, you know, with the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff, they're finding evidence of all these other Gospels. And some of them were, you know, what they did, they chose the 4 that made sense, but there's Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Hebrews, Gospel of Mary, and they had one Gospel where Jesus was a kid, and I remember one of the rationale that they didn't use it. Somebody said something mean to him, and Jesus looked at him and he dropped dead. You know, so it's kind of an interesting, these are the ones that kind of met the test of some sort of reasonableness. And I like it too. I think usually it was a movement to have just one gospel. I think that's what Luke kind of would have wanted, but I think it's better that they did it the way they did it and kind of had these different views.
Hey, Mike, some of my fundamental friends, Christian friends, make a big deal out of when Jesus died, the curtain of the temple was split in two. Which gospel is that in?
I think that may be in the very first one, maybe in Mark.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
The symbolism being that you don't need a priest or something to be in your behalf or something for.
well, people, like I said, many interpretations out there.
Yeah.
And maybe this is an old temple. All right, guys, thank you. That's it. Yeah.